Okay, Rabbi, will you please begin?
Sure. Thank you so much, Dr. Blumenthal, for being here. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. I'm going to really just frame our discussion for 3 or 4 minutes and then turn it over to Dr. Blumenthal for the bulk of the presentation this evening. I'm going to first begin by reading a chapter of Tehillim. Obviously, we can't do this responsively since we are over Zoom, so I will read it. Everyone is certainly welcome to say it along with me, after which I'll say the Mishbeach L'Chayalei Tzahal, and then a remark for 60 seconds or so, and then we will turn it over. Shira malos b'mamakim krasicha Adonai, Adonai shema b'koli etiyanos necha kashuvos l'kol tachanunai im avonos tishmor ya Adonai miyamod ki yemecha haslicha leman tivarei ki visi Adonai kivsa nafshi b'lidvaro hochalti Nafshi Adonai mishomrim laboker shomerim laboker Yachel Yisrael el Adonai ki im Adonai achesed beharbei mofidus behu yiftes Yisrael mikol avonosav Yishiberach Avosenu Abraham Yitzchak v'Yaakov hu yivarech es chayalei tzva ha'aganah Yisrael v'anshei kachot ha'bitachon ha'amdim ha'mishmaratzenu v'rei Eloheinu Migvul halvanon ve'ad midbar Mitzrayim min hayam hagadol ad levohar ava ubechol makom shehem b'yabasha ba'avir v'yam Yitein Adonai et Avinu hakamim alenu nigafim lefnehem Hakadosh Baruch Hu yishmor v'yatzil et chayalin mikol tzara v'tzukah mikonegel machala yishlach bracha v'atzlacha b'chol ma'aseh yedehem yad be'er sonenu tachtehem v'yatreim b'cheter yishua v'ater nitzachon v'kiyam b'hem hakatuv ki Adonai Elohechem halechim lachem v'ilachem lachem imoy v'echem l'shiatchem v'nomar Amen. I think the question that I've been getting, the only one that I've been getting slightly more than how are you doing, is the question of how to deal with and how to speak with our children around the tragic events that have taken place in Israel. And I'm certainly not an expert, so we decided this evening to bring in one to share with us some insight and some guidance on that. I'd just like to frame it with a brief thought that I heard, a beautiful thought that I heard this past Shabbos from a dear friend and treasured member of our community, Evan Sohn. Evan told me that he shared this with his son, who was studying for the year in Israel. Evan asked, why is it that we don't hear anything about Moshe's children? Aaron's children assume the mantle, they kind of take over the leadership position of Aaron, but Moshe's children, you never hear from them. And what Evan suggested was that we know that when the going got tough, Moshe shipped his children out. He sent them back to Midian, and they were in a cloistered, sheltered environment. They weren't exposed to the trials and the tribulations and the difficulties and the challenges and the problems that were the Shibud Mitzrayim and Yetzias Mitzrayim. They weren't there for the action. They didn't see the miracles. They didn't see the wonders. They didn't have the front row seat that Aaron's children had in the unfolding of Jewish history. And so they weren't hardened to those kinds of situations. Since they didn't experience history, they couldn't be part of history in the same kind of way as Aaron's children were. And many of us feel worried about our children, how they're processing this information, what it's going to mean to them, how to properly frame it for them, how to discuss it with them, how to answer their very often probing and poignant questions. And we're going to get all of those and more from Dr. Blumenthal tonight. But what I would just tell you all is we should take comfort is maybe not the right word, because it's very hard to be comfortable at anything now, but maybe some nechama in the fact that our children are living Jewish history together with us. They are on the front lines, and the fact that they are here asking those questions, living through the history, wanting to know, seeking answers to these very difficult problems is, in the long run, we hope, something that will inure to their benefit. Being there for them is always super important, and having the right things to say and knowing what to say and what not to say is so incredibly important. And we're going to hear from Dr. Blumenthal's wisdom in just a moment. But again, our children have a front row seat in the unfolding of Jewish history, and that is something which is incredibly, incredibly special. And hopefully, through tonight's session and helping one another and supporting one another in the days and weeks to come, we can hopefully gather together the wisdom and the courage to be able to answer those questions as meaningfully and as productively as possible. Dr. Blumenthal.
Thank you very much, Roy. What a beautiful introduction, and not surprised, but it really sets the tone, and it's a very beautiful idea that I hadn't thought of about our children being part of history, and I will incorporate that into my thoughts. Let me, I often mention how the rabbi of my community, when I grew up with your father, Rabbi Block, used to begin his sermons with, "Before I speak, I want to say something." So before I speak, I also want to say something. First of all, I want to thank Rabbi Block and thank the Keshet community for inviting me. It's a very special community. Unfortunately, I've had to visit in circumstances that we'd rather forget. But I still appreciate both Rabbi Block's leadership and the dedication, devotion, and the closeness, the cohesion of Yeshua and your community. I want to also acknowledge OHEL that's allowing me to do this, our CEO, David Mendel, and our Presidium of Mel Zachter and Jay Kestenbaum, and a special thank you to Ari Königsberg, who is handling the technology part. When you get to be my age, you're all the more appreciated of those who are adept in technology. What I want to do tonight is I want to share a little bit about how my thinking has evolved over the last 9 days. And I'm sharing it not because I want a forum just to share my own feelings, but I think it may be reflective of what's happening in the community. And then talk a little bit about taking care of yourselves, because that always has to precede taking care of your children, then go through the different ages of children and how they manage this, and also with a bit of a focus on what's turned out to be a very big part of this is dealing with the rise of anti-Semitism and all those very vociferous groups that are looking at this as justified, this atrocities, or even going so far as to blame Israel for who are the victims of this atrocity. I will try to do this all in 20 to 30 minutes so we have some time for questions. A little hours late, and I have flexibility because it is the last thing I'm doing tonight, but hopefully we can get some questions in, and those who may have private questions. By the way, you submit the questions to the Q&A or the chat, which is in the bottom of your screen, but this is a webinar format, so you can't just speak it, announce them, but please do submit them. And if you have a private question, either send it directly to me or to Rabbi Block, and I will try to remember to post my email address and my cell phone number for those who may need to speak to me about anything. And if for some reason I forget, I give Rabbi Block full permission to share all that information and make myself available. As I am available, as we say, 24/6. First of all, before I start, I also want to mention that perhaps maybe I'll share a story from my YU days. I had the very special chus of being in the Shir of Aaron Kreiser, Zichrono Livracha, who was one of the great Rabbanim of that time, that transitional generation from the Holocaust to America. He had been with the Mir in China. And in my years in YU, everybody was going into law and medicine. And I was an upper senior, I was already in graduate school, so I was starting to goof off a bit. And he was giving me some well-deserved rebukes, some musser. And then at one point he said to me, "And you're going to medical school, right?" And I said, "No." He said, "Law school?" I said, "No." He says, "What are you doing?" So I said, "Psychology." And he said, "Psychology?" And he took me outside and he said something to me that I think of almost every day. He put me up against the wall with his finger in my face. He said, "Blumenthal, you want to be a psychologist? You got to be a gaon. You got to be a genius." He said, "A doctor, a lung is a lung, but every patient that comes to your office is a parsha bifnei atzma." He's his own person. So then he said to me, "So study hard, read the books, and listen to your professors, because it's not an easy profession." And I often say it's well over 40 years later, in fact, probably about 45 years later. And every time I have a new patient that comes to me, and every time I have a new situation, I say to myself, I see Rabbi Kreiser in front of me, I say, "You know what? You're starting from scratch. You don't know." And that's true here too. Everybody is unique. Some of the things I hope I say will be relevant. If I say something and it doesn't resonate with you or it doesn't make sense for your child, then I'm wrong, because everybody has a different history. Everybody is unique. And therefore, that's going to be true here as well. So I want to tell you I think if I had given this talk, I'm going to say Friday afternoon, but I might even say this morning, it would have been very different. And I will explain to you why. There are two types of differentiations we make in trauma, and I'm changing my opinion of how they are. One differentiation is what we call primary trauma versus either secondary or vicarious trauma. So primary trauma is when, God forbid, a trauma happens to you. So never all those people attending the concert in southern Israel, all those people on Kibbutz Be'eri and all the commuting in neighboring communities, they experience primary trauma of unthinkable proportions. We who read about it and hear about it, we're experiencing secondary trauma. And secondary trauma and primary trauma have similarities and differences. I've come to the realization, I think, today, and that's, I'm sure, I think it may be the realization we all have, is that I don't think that differentiation, it makes sense. I mean, granted, no doubt that those who faced the terrorists, Yamach Shemam B'Zichram, certainly are highly more traumatized than we are. But this is not a secondary trauma for us. This is a primary trauma. We are traumatized by what happened. We are traumatized by the world's reaction. And the reaction we're having seems to resemble much more primary trauma, albeit maybe not as severe. But this is a primary trauma, and I'll explain a little bit more later why. There's another differentiation we make, and for that, I'm going to share a personal process that I've been through. A number of years ago, there was a whole bunch of literature that came out in the area of positive psychology on gratitude. There was a psychologist, I think his name was Worthington, if I recall correctly, who did a lot of research on gratitude, on saying thank you, and found that people who express, not just think it, but actively express gratitude are physically healthier, live longer, have happier marriages, make more money. I mean, just about every criteria that would be important. People who are able to express gratitude are much better off. And I've tried to incorporate them in life. In fact, I will tell you that today, I did not make mincha at my shul, so I raced over to the Young Israel Woodmere, because I'm not going to make some minyan on Rosh Chodesh with everything that's going on. And Rav Shai Shechter was there. And I waited for him to finish his Shemona Esrei or his davening, which was much longer than mine. And I just came up to him and I just said, when next time you speak to your father, thank him from us for all his leadership and direction. It's important. And I'm sure you're expressing your debt of gratitude to Rabbi Block for the same thing. But I thought to myself when I was reading this literature, the recommendation is you should keep a gratitude journal. Every night you should write down something, or every day you should tell somebody something you're grateful about. I thought, I don't have to do that. I have it in the davening. We have modim 3 times a day. We thank Hashem. So I was makabel. I took upon myself that every time I say modim, I try to think about something I'm grateful about. My family, my wife, my beautiful home. The fact that I can visit my children in New Jersey, and it's not hard because we have bridges over rivers. I'm trying to be creative, coming up with different things that I can be grateful for. I will admit that after last week, after Shmini Atzeres, I had a very hard time with that. I had a very hard time. I'm going to thank Hashem that I have a car when people are being held hostage. I'm going to thank Hashem that I have a beautiful family. When people have been abused after watching their family massacred, I couldn't do it. But I can't skip modim. I have to say modim. So I came to it took some work. I was processing it and I was working at it. And I came to the conclusion that I'm just going to say my modim now is, Hashem, I know you're running the world. That's all I'm going to say. I know you're doing something. It makes no sense. I can't. And I can't even fathom what function or purpose this is, but I'm acknowledging. The modim took on a different format. And I think this is happening to us as well. When we talk about trauma, we talk about one time, like a sudden trauma and chronic trauma. And the sudden trauma is that one-time event, that car accident, that the residential fire, God forbid. It's a one-time event. We're reeling from it. And the work is to reclaim our sense of safety and our sense of predictability. Chronic trauma is that trauma that is day in and day out. We experienced it quite a bit during COVID, but more typically it's considered lengthy incarceration, poverty, abuse from which the person has no escape. And the reactions are very different. The reaction to a one-time traumatic event is shock and horror. The reaction to an ongoing trauma is a sort of resignation. And I find that changing inside of me, and I think I find it changing among all of us, where this is not something that's going away too soon. This is something that's now redefining our reality. And I'm going to revisit this later when I talk about what I think we have to be careful about to avoid, or what can happen when it's ongoing. But it's starting to feel that way, and that I think that was reflected in my change in my modem. So let me start with how we take care of ourselves and how we take care of our children. So first of all, as we always tell people, we always use that metaphor from the flight, from the airlines, from the safety instructions. Put the oxygen on yourself first. You cannot help your children until you have managed it. Now, managed it does not mean you're not scared. Managed it does not mean you're not sad. But it is, you're in the driver's seat. You have it under control. You have it mastered. I often reference, some of you may remember from a few years ago, from 5 years ago, the Sassoon fire, when 7 out of 8 children perished. And the most common question we got asked after that fire was, can I cry in front of my children? Can I cry in front of my Talmid and my students? And our answer was, you can't shriek and scream. You can't pull your hair out. But if tears roll down your cheek when you're talking about a tragedy of this magnitude, that's not only okay, that's instructive. We have this belief sometimes that strength means being stoic. And sometimes I tell people, if that's strength, that being strong and unemotional is strength, then our avos and imos were not strong. Because if you go through Parshas Bereshis, the avos and imos, Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov, they had every emotion under the sun. They cried, they trembled, they were scared. What they did with those emotions is what makes them the superlative people that they are, and our role models. But they had emotions, and you can have emotions, but you have to organize them. In fact, one of my favorite studies that I quote almost in every webinar I give was a study in which they compared tears. When they compared the tears that we cry from pain, that all of us have been crying for these last few days, with the tears that people get from cutting onions or other irritants. And they're very different tears. The tears from pain have stress hormones in them. When we have a good cry, we're ridding the body of stress hormones. The tears from the onions don't have those stress hormones. So it's, again, or I sometimes like to quote Harry Stack Sullivan, the founder of the American School of Psychiatry. When he was teaching his residents and interns, he used to tell them that when you're doing therapy, there should be only one anxious person in the room, preferably not the therapist. And the same thing is true with our children. We have to process it ourselves. We have to organize it ourselves, and then we can share it with our children. Now, and by the way, please don't think you're going to fool your children. We wear our trauma on our sleeves, and our children know us inside out. If you think you're going to try to act it or fake it, they'll see right through it. Process it yourself, help our children. That's the order. The other thing to keep in mind, by the way, and this is very important, both in terms of ourselves and for our children, is that we visit trauma. We don't live in it. Even if you're recovering from what might be considered a more typical trauma, such as one of the examples I gave, a vehicular accident, an assault, or a natural disaster, we don't just, it's on our mind, and we get flashbacks and get trigger responses, but it's an in and out experience. Grief is the same way, that when we're grieving someone, we visit, we experience the grief, we take a break from that grief. And that's important in terms of processing, and both to teach our children and processing this trauma ourselves. We have to keep in touch. We have to be aware. We have to be aware what's happening. We have to think about it. We have to feel for our brethren in Israel, and of course, Hashem should rescue them, the hostages. But we can't be busy with it all the time because we mentally can't handle it. I'll give a simple example. My recreational reading is anything but mental health. I need to get away from it. So the book I was reading when all this happened was a book entitled Palestine 1936, which is about the Arab uprising in 1936 during the time of the Yishuv, a history book with just pure cold history. I mean, it's not cold, but it's well written, but it's, about that year or those years. And after this happened, I couldn't read it. It was very bloody. There were a lot of assaults against Jews. The Arabs were rioting, and it just was too close to home. And I had to put it down. I couldn't read it anymore. And that's, we have to know that. We have to know how much we can handle. And this, by the way, is particularly important for those of our children who are on social media and on the internet. I can still remember a time when there were 3 newspapers in New York and 5 TV channels. And that was where your news came from. Today, there are thousands of sources of news, all competing for your attention, and some trying to compete by being more gruesome and sensational. We have to teach ourselves, practice, and teach our children. Know where your news comes from. Be selective what you watch. You don't have to see everything, and there may be images that you shouldn't see because it'll be imprinted on your brain, and you know what happened. You don't have to actually see it. And take in as much as you can and then take a break from it. Our goal as we train our children to manage the internet and social media, which is here to stay, is not to get rid of it, but to learn how to manage it, to be in charge of it. You control it, it doesn't control you. And therefore, we have to teach our children that, and we have to practice it. Another very important tool in terms of managing trauma for ourselves and again for our children is to talk about it. And talk about it doesn't necessarily mean because the person you speak to is going to have some insight, or that the person or if you're the audience, that you're going to have some insight. But the mere process of putting the experience into words makes it more manageable. Basil van der Kolk, whom I'm sure many of you have heard of, who is the foremost expert on neuroanatomy of trauma and has written many books readable for the general population. Probably the most popular is The Body Keeps the Score. He did an interesting experiment after 9/11. He got people who survived the Twin Towers, and he hooked them up to, I don't know, an MRI, a PET scan, some way in which he could watch the brain. And he asked them to remember what happened. And as they recalled it, the part of the brain that was stimulated was deep in the brain stem. If you know the shape of the brain, it's like a sort of tube and then it gets wide. And so this was deep in the tube part of the brain, the amygdala, a very primitive part of the brain, the part of the brain we share with the animal kingdom. It's all emotion, impulse, etc. And then he said to them, now tell me what happened. And as they talked about it, you could literally see it anatomically shift from deep in the brainstem to the frontal cortex, to the Broca center, which is language, logic, the part of the brain we use when we learn Torah, when we think things out, when we plan our parenting skills. And this was, and so literally putting it in words, just in that alone, and that's very important if you, in case you're the audience, in case your child comes to you, talk to you, that letting them put it into words in and of itself gives them mastery over it. So again, allow your children to speak and you speak as well. And then one more thing is do something. Trauma is basically fear. Now, if we think about fear, if you're, take a silly example, you're walking in the jungle and a hungry lion is running towards you, you're going to experience fear. Fear prompts action. You know, you're going to run away, you'll climb a tree, you'll shoot the lion, you'll do something. Trauma is a type of fear, and trauma is relieved when we can do something. I will share again my own personal experience. I was in Montreal over Yom Tov visiting the kids. I heard what happened gradually, and I remember Matzah Simchas Torah. I was coming home and I dreaded turning on my phone. It was a horrible day. And when I came home, I turned on my phone. I was just as despondent as one could be. But then the emails came in and the phone calls, mostly from OHEL. We've got to set up recommendations. We have to create a webinar. We have to, and suddenly I had things to do. And I can't tell you how incredibly therapeutic it was to be active. But, and again, active doesn't mean you have to like abandon your family and your business and run into Israel and jump into a tank. But the heroic soldiers are doing that already, and God should preserve them and bless them. But you can write to politicians. You can do the davening that we just did. You can take on something. I know my wife and I took on an extra stringency with our Shabbat, just for the sake of what's going on. But it really helps. And for our children as well. Send cards to the Chayalim. Help them collect things to send. Let them say their types of davening, as much davening as they can do. And that's not only right from hashkafic perspective, which your rabbi can direct you more better than I can, but it's also very helpful from a personal perspective in terms of helping yourself manage. So that's, again, another very important part of managing this trauma. Let me talk a little bit about different ages of children and how they process it. And we're going to talk three groups. We're going to talk preschool age children, in other words, till age 5, 6, let's say. Elementary school age children, let's say 6 to 12. And then we're going to talk about adolescents. If there's time, maybe I'll try to address quickly some issues with regard to adult children who are in Israel right now. So preschool age children are not going to understand. They're not going to understand. They don't know where Israel is. Obviously, they're not going to understand what's happening, but they can have a sense that the world doesn't seem right. They're going to have just a few sense. We saw it in our 2-year-old granddaughter when we were in Montreal that she had you could tell from her behavior that she knew we weren't ourselves. And but again, if they need an explanation, you may have to tell them, first of all, this is happening very far away. They don't have that sense of geography, that there is no imminent threat to them. And the other very important point with preschool age children is, and this applies to anything that might happen, is that they don't understand the concept rare. You can't tell them, oh, it's highly unlikely, because their world is 2 blocks long. Rare means it's going to happen. We assure our children that they're safe at that age. They're safe, and it's nothing like this is going to happen to them in case they do find out or sense that something that's happening. But just an interesting thought, 2 important points with preschool age children. First, what I mentioned earlier is all the more important with children this age is that they're going to listen to your voice tone and your body language. So be very cognizant of how you speak to them. It's more important than the words. Is that they see that you're regulated and you're in good control, they'll feel safe and they'll feel secure. Preserve their routine. That's also very important, even though you are perhaps not yourself. And the last but not least, sometimes when people call me and say, I'm just not sure how my 4-year-old, my 5-year-old is managing this situation. Sometimes what I tell them is, I'll ask them that engage in an imaginary play, which most children that age do. Playing house, playing family, playing school, with dolls, action figures, which is very normal for that age. And usually when they're busy playing, we're happy to leave them alone. We're happy to have a minute away from them. But listen to their play. Because children who are troubled or preoccupied, they'll play it. And interestingly enough, and if this happens, I'm happy you can call me and I'll assist you with it. But if you want to communicate to them a message of safety, play it out with them. Get on your hands and knees and introduce new figures and new people that can communicate to them safety. That's a very useful way of helping children that age. Elementary school age children, there's a very big change. They understand how big the world is. They understand that as terrible as this is, that ISIS is not attacking us in Englewood and Tenafly. They also understand the concept of rare, if we want to bring that across to them, that this is not typical, this is a rare occurrence. So they can understand that. Typically, important points in terms of children this age is that, first of all, they're usually very interested in facts. And that's something that might throw you off. You might think, gee, my child is callous. What I'm telling them about such an enormous tragedy, and instead of hurting and instead of feeling what's going on, they're asking like, well, exactly how did they get through the fence? And what kind of guns did they use? And is it true? I heard from so-and-so that they da da da. That's very typical for this age. There's a reason for that. If we have time, I can go into it. But that's very normal. Don't be shocked by these kind of questions. The other thing, by the way, that many children do, but elementary school age children do that in particular, is when they hear shocking news, they hear upsetting news, very often they withdraw. And what I mean is they'll say, you'll tell them something or you explain something to them, and that's really sad and scary. And they'll say, okay, can I play now? Or can I go on the computer? Or can I have a snack? And you're like, huh? What's the matter with you? But they have a very adaptive ability to sort of shut down, not respond, and then come back later with questions. I always say jokingly, usually at the single most inconvenient time imaginable, but they have that ability to kind of like crawl into their shell and then take the information in bite-sized portions. The only response you have to say, no problem, but if you have any questions, any concerns, come to us and we'll answer them. The other thing that's important with children this age is that they tend to see the world in a very polarized way. It's good guys, bad guys, righteous people, evil people, and we teach them that the righteous usually win. This has been a problem because, unfortunately, certainly early on, the evil people, the Amalek of today, were winning, or did us much harm. And I think we have to then, if this comes up and if this would be destabilizing them, assure them of the strength of the Israeli army, our resolve to be victorious, and even some of the accomplishments already, albeit despite the terrible and unthinkable losses. Just very quickly about adolescence. And again, I'm giving you the headlines. If you have more questions, I'll go into it some more. Adolescence, in pre-adolescence are usually not busy trying to figure out why bad things happen to good people. They're not trying to figure out God. The adolescent is. The adolescent, because of their cognitive development and some of their needs developmentally, they will ask God questions. They will, and which are, as we all know, are the unanswerable questions. But the good news is that they also are at an age where they can understand the idea that there are questions we can't answer. And I sometimes, when I'm dealing with this, like to quote the Kotzker Rebbe, who used to say, I could never believe in a God I could understand. And the inexplicable nature, how God by definition has to be beyond our comprehension, has to be inexplicable, is something an adolescent can wrap their hands around about. The pre-adolescent can't and won't. That's not of interest to them. And again, please don't worry that your child is rebelling just because they ask these questions. It's very typical for this age. And you can have a conversation and you can even share how you struggle with this very same question. The other thing that develops during adolescence, and this we'll see more with girls than with boys, although gender differences are getting more and more blurred, but is at this age, they've developed the capacity to empathize and not just sympathize. And I'm sure, as you know, empathy means literally being able to imagine yourself that person. Sympathy is more, I know something terrible happened to the person, but I can't imagine it. And that skill develops really during adolescence, especially early adolescence. And sometimes when kids have a new skill, they overplay it. And a problem you can have is, it'd be very typical for especially an early adolescent to literally imagine themselves at that concert, or literally try to imagine themselves the hostages, they're the families of these hostages, and they can get very overwrought. And then if they're posting their feelings and emotions online and along with other comparably aged children, there can be a real contagion. So they have to learn to shut it off. As I said, we visit trauma, we don't get consumed by it. And this would be an age where we'd have to be concerned about that. 2 minutes on adult children in Israel. If your child's in a seminary or yeshiva, again, we just did a webinar on that on Thursday with Rabbi Ephraim Goldberg and Aviva Goldstein. It was a wonderful webinar with like 600 people on it. So I recommend you access that on the Overhill website. And we've done a number of webinars if you're interested. But just very quickly, there's no right or wrong. When it comes to question whether they should come home, should they stay, it really depends on a host of factors. It depends on the child themselves. A very anxious child probably shouldn't stay. A reckless child that takes risks, takes gambles, or maybe not so careful about his or her safety, should not stay. The other child, it may depend on what they're trying to accomplish in seminary or yeshiva. Are they aliyah bound? Is that they're very much their thinking? Then there'd be a more compelling reason to stay. If they're just staying because it's a nice experience and their thinking is more in terms of coming back here, and again, without judgment. No, we're in no position to judge people. Then maybe they should come back. But please don't think there's one hard and fast rule. And they're adults. Have a conversation with them. Make a decision together. And there's no right or wrong answer. As far, if any of you have children in the Army, we're going to be dedicating, by the way, we will be having a webinar this week for parents who have parents of lone soldiers in the Army. So we'll have a previous lone soldier on and a parent of a lone soldier on. But generally, what I'm going to tell you from just the calls I've gotten so far, both here and from in Israel, the key is, I know you're scared, and I know you're worried. Please don't give that over to them. If they're on the Gaza border or the Lebanese border, they cannot access that. That needs to be put aside. You need to tell them how proud you are, how supportive you are of them, and how much you love them. And that should be the width and breadth of your conversation. One more interesting thing that I had not anticipated but was also gives me reason to believe that this is a primary trauma. A lot of people, especially our children that I've talked to or parents I've spoken to, are very traumatized by the presence of anti-Semitism, by the very vociferous support that Hamas is getting here and elsewhere. And it's really having a highly traumatic effect on us as adults and on our children. I want to give you just two pieces of advice how to process that with your children, because it is a hot potato. It is very, very destabilizing to the kids. First of all, there's also some wonderful support. I mean, our president, the mayor of New York City, they've really come out strongly supporting Israel. Access that too, or let them access it. It's not so one-sided. We have a tendency to make the negative bigger than the positive. I often like to quote the great sportscaster Vince Scully, who was a sportscaster like forever, and he used to say that losing feels more bad than winning feels good. So we do amplify the negative, but there's a lot of support and a lot of people who recognize the atrocities that have been committed and the necessity for Israel to respond in the way it does. You can balance that with those kind of, by accessing those presentations. But I want to give one more suggestion. There's a host of literature that came out of Emory University on ancestry. In fact, David Beshefkin interviewed the researchers about this a number of years ago, right before Pesach. And the research shows that people who are familiar with their past, who know about their family history, who know about their nation's history, have far better coping skills than those who don't. And by the way, only 3 out of 4 Americans can name all their grandparents. Boggling. But the awareness of our legacy helps us cope. And let's hold down to that for a second. Then I want to quote another line that was a very famous insight from Rav Soloveitchik, who would often differentiate between secular historians and Jewish historians. He would say secular historians use the past to understand the present. The Jewish historian looks at the future to understand the present. We're going somewhere. We're heading towards something. And I think I want to propose to you, and that it'll help, is if we take those two insights and bring them together. What's happening now is horrible, terrible, and very scary. I am scared. I readily admit it. I don't walk in the street like I used to. I'm vigilant and concerned, but it's on a timeline. Anti-Semitism, hatred for Jews goes back to the Bible, goes back to Chumash, Yitzhak and Yishmael, Yaakov and Esav. It's part of our history, and we've triumphed over it every time, although we've taken casualties along the way, and we're going somewhere. So there's this very big timeline of past, present, future. The present now, as awful as it is just one chapter. And when we look at it from that perspective, or when we give that perspective over to our children, we're diluting it's bad, but we're diluting it a bit because it's not the whole world. It's in that large timeline. And I would encourage you in your conversations with the children, especially your older children, to cast it in that framework. The last thing I want to mention, and this harks back to what I said before about how the trauma seems to be changing. The trauma seems to be becoming something like a new reality. This afternoon, I presented to Chabad Shluchim, and they were asking questions afterwards. And one of the questions someone asked, the last question is always the bombshell, the one that you're least prepared for. And the last question was, you told us a lot of things to do. What should we not do? And it came to me, and I think I'd like to share with you my answer. I said to them, don't despair. We have to be very careful. Yeyish, despair, hopelessness is a terrible place to be. And even though it's starting to feel like this is a new reality, and even though there's a distinct, I hope not, but there's this distinct possibility that what's happening and its lingering effects will go on, will linger, and will change our very perspective on who we are as Jews in this world and our relative safety. It's a very dangerous place for ourselves and our children to think that life, that any kind of good life as we know it is coming to an end. Again, we're on a timeline. We really believe that. And we have to fight that because that's the most dangerous outcome of chronic trauma. The person who is in a chronic traumatic situation shuts down, gives up. And those are some of the hardest trauma victims for us to help. So we have to work together to be realistic, recognize what we're facing with our children, and at the same time, not give up on hope of better times and hopefully as a non-harmful or at least harmful resolution of this crisis. I hope that's been helpful. I'd like to again invite everybody to submit. I see one Q&A came in, but please, and again, if you want to anonymously, you can direct it straight to me or to Rabbi Block, the questions. Here's an anonymous question. My 5-year-old daughter came home and told us she heard from a friend that in Israel, the bad guys came in the middle of the night and steal the babies. How do you recommend we respond? Okay, so that's a very good question and a very timely question. And if this had been 15 years ago, I might have suggested to you, tell her it's not true, or just say, no, or it happened once, it never happened, something like that. The problem we have today is that, excuse me, there was a time when adults were the gatekeepers of information for children, where we the adults determined what children know and don't know. And the children, it was a mutual agreement. The children were very happy that we insulated them from the truth. Today, because of the changes with technology, because children today can click a mouse and find out anything, not only are they accessing information, but they feel entitled to know. Now, if it had been a 4-year-old, I probably would have resorted back to, that's a story or so, or say, yeah, it did happen once, but the baby's going to be rescued. I'd make believe for them. 5-year-olds are starting to get close to that age where they're starting to know what goes on in the world and they want to know. So I would tell you that it depends on, and the very fact that they had that conversation with a friend would probably have been unthinkable in time, because you have to test your child. If your child is a mature 5-year-old, is a child who's curious and wants to find out and is going to fact check what you tell them, you may have to tell them, yes, it did happen. It's not going to happen here. It happened far away. And we're going to protect you, so you don't have to worry about this. It did happen, and it's very, very sad, and it makes all of us sad. You may be more. You might have to be truthful because they're going to check with the 7-year-old cousin, or they may oversee something or overhear conversations. That's interesting. I got several calls from some of the more insulated Hasidic communities, and they were struggling. Also, they say, our kids don't have internet, they don't read the news. We have to tell them. And I'd say to them, listen, there's always that kid who's making believe he's going to sleep and he's listening to the parents' conversations. So we're erring in the direction of sharing. If we're on the fence, we're sharing more readily, which by the way might be one of the reasons why children are more anxious today than they have been, because we don't have that bubble of naivete that they used to have. So again, I would tell you, if it's a mature 5-year-old, it's a 5-year-old who makes it her business to find things out, we may have to be truthful. I'm sorry to say, it pains me to say it, that a 5-year-old has to know this. If it's a more still, a mature 5-year-old, let's say, or a 5-year-old who doesn't want to know what's really going on, is happy to be oblivious, then we'll give them some reason, some sort of answer that we would have given years ago. I see a whole bunch of more questions came in. Again, I hope that was helpful. I was surprised my 5-year-old again, who wasn't behaving for a few days, finally told me he was afraid his grandparents in Israel would die. It helped when we did a video call with the family in Israel, and they saw they were okay and their bomb shelter. Okay, very interesting question and very, very relevant. First of all, this question captures 2 pointers. One is that children are not always very precise with their response, especially younger children. They don't necessarily, they don't feel necessarily scared, sad. They feel ochi. And sometimes the child that is aggressive is really scared. Sometimes the kid is scared, is really angry. And sometimes the child that cries is frightened, and sometimes the child who's fighting more with their sibling is really, is really sad. So when you see a child who's not themselves, yes, something is troubling them. And they are also very responsive at this age to what they see. So when you were able to show them your grandparents, their grandparents, and show them that they're okay, that's very comforting, because they respond in a sort of very concrete way to what they see. So again, you didn't need me, you did, you handled it perfectly. 9-year-old daughter doesn't want to talk to us about things because she's depressed for discussing it at school. How can we engage her in conversation? Okay, these are wonderful questions, great questions. So I said earlier, everybody copes their own way. David Pelkovitz likes to talk about the attenders and distractors. That when it comes to trauma, some people deal with trauma by wanting to know, and some people deal with trauma by not wanting to know. We found out even with Holocaust survivors. There were Holocaust survivors who coped well by talking about it and giving testimony, and some Holocaust survivors dealt better by saying, that happened, I don't want to think about it. And the attender has to attend and the distractor has to distract. There's not one size that fits all. So if somebody says, it's too much for me, I don't want to deal with it anymore, please respect that. It's not because they're denying reality. It's not because they're trying to get away from it. That's her coping skill, and it's perfectly okay because that works for her. You certainly make it clear that if she ever does need to speak, or if there's something that's distressing or confusing, she does not have to, even though we're upset about it, she can talk to us, but please don't pressure her to talk. That's her coping skill. Okay, next one. I'm just going in order, so please, how can we help our kids and ourselves anticipate the likely continued casualties en masse for both Israel and those in Gaza? Okay, so again, a great question. And for ourselves, yes, we have to brace ourselves. We really do have to brace ourselves. You know, I remember when I used to do substance abuse treatment many years ago, the substance abusers used to say that reality is for people who can't handle drugs. You know, there is reality, and it's a very dangerous situation. We have to differentiate between what is anticipation that we kind of brace ourselves so we can handle it versus what we hope for. Hope is boundless, and we can hope for a complete dissolution of Hamas without anybody getting as much as bruised. That's okay, and we can pray for that. That God can do miracles, and we know that. But we also have to be realistic. And we have to be, you know, realistic that al pi derech hateva, in terms of natural anticipation of things, that's not likely to happen. And I do think we have to brace ourselves. As far as our children goes, you know, again, it depends on the child. If your child is interested, your child is involved, if your child feels secure by knowing and not ever being blindsided, we may have to mention that I'm probably an older child. I don't think we would talk like that to younger children. If the child is just having a hard enough time with the reality right now and does not have the mental space, or if you yourself don't have the mental space to enter that place, then I would say, let's hold off for now. Don't make them any false assurance. We never give false assurance. So if the child says, well, is it over now? Nobody else is going to get hurt. We can't tell them that. We don't know that. We can say we can hope for that, but we can't give them any assurance. But before we actually bring it up, or we share our own concerns along those lines, we have to understand how the child operates. For example, very intelligent children who are losaholics will want to know. Those children who are, just as I said, trying their best to handle it now, we would not go into that subject. Okay, let me just. What if a teenager is not talking about it? Should we be concerned if they are not talking? Are there talking prompts that you can share? So again, if the child is not talking about it because that's how they cope, or they're saturated already by what they know, please leave them alone. Everybody knows intuitively what's best for them. Now, if the child is not talking about it, one of the things we have to consider, this is something we call a shared traumatic reality. There's a whole literature on that from Naomi Baum in Israel. That, in fact, those of you who saw our webinar on Monday night, we had Naomi Baum, who's a trauma expert, present together with me, and that's a different Naomi Baum. There are two American alot to Israel who are both trauma experts and both named Naomi Baum. But the other Naomi Baum has written a lot about shared traumatic reality, because we're traumatized and we're trying to help our children. I'm traumatized and I'm trying to help you. It's an interesting predicament to be in. Now, if your child is refraining from asking you or talking to you because they're afraid about your well-being, then again, assuming you are handling it, you have to let them know there's no question, there's no topic that they can't bring up with you. Unless you yourself are not able to, then please encourage them to talk to someone else. Let them designate someone else who they can talk to. But if they are on their own, not because of any attempt to protect you, but this is what they need to do, I don't think there's a need to prompt them. Now, if for some reason you might feel that they're sort of on the fence, they don't know, or maybe they're not great at expressing feelings, so it may be hard for them. one of the things you can do is not, the thing you absolutely do not do is interrogate them. Do not ask leading questions, because that'll just cause them to withdraw more. Try to create a milieu where natural sharing will take place. So take a walk with them. Tell them, you know what, I got to go to such and such place, a long drive, I could use some company. Try to create settings that are relaxing and conducive to sharing, and then see if they more spontaneously share, or for that matter, just without overdoing it, share some of your own reactions, like I did here in your webinar. Share some of your own experience, not, terror and all that, but interesting insights you might have gained, or way you might have grown in some way as a result, and that may prompt some reciprocation. But if their way of coping is not talking about it, please respect it. It's perfectly okay. Okay, how to help children with family, cousins in Israel when saying it's happening far away won't be as reassuring. Okay, I think that's a very good. These questions are great, Rabbi. You've trained your community well. Yes, you're 100% right that when you know it's someone you know, it's someone you're connected to, it feels closer. And that certainly is the case, that if you have cousins and relatives whose lives are right now, in danger, it'll feel much closer. It'll feel much closer for your child. When I say it's far away, it's only to the extent that which the child feels that this very same danger could be on their block, or very same danger could happen in their community. And here, that's the times when we have to say, even though we feel very close to it, it's not right here. But you're right, and they will feel it more, and that just has to be, we can never minimize how useful it is to validating feelings. Again, I'm going to quote my friend and colleague David Pelkovitz, who often points out that the word ishor, to confirm, is also ashrei, meaning happiness. That when you validate, it's helpful. Okay, I was seeing a lot of questions. I'm going to try to get to them all. I can stay on later, Rabbi, if you can, and I assume it's okay with Ari also. Okay, I have a 9-year-old daughter who's very intellectual, mature. What should I share? What should I not? Thanks. Okay. Again, great question. Research shows that precocious children, or what we sometimes refer to as intellectually gifted children, all our children are gifts, but and all of them are intellectually gifted, tend to have more anxiety. And they tend to have more anxiety because they know more and they understand things at a deeper level. So yes, in a way, it's probably surprising to say that, but a very mature and very intelligent child is more at risk. We would think that would be a strength, but it's really more at risk. And they need more conversation, and they need more validation. And you're going to delve into the situation more, and you're going to acknowledge the severity of it, but you're also going to show them the videos of the unity, of the connection. You're going to tell them stories also of victories in the part of the army. You're going to give them that balanced picture, so it's not all negative, but you are going to be more actively processing it with a child who is both more intellectual, more inquisitive, and more grown up. There might be a first child who tend to be more interested in the adult world. How do we preserve our young child under 8 years old feeling that Israel is an amazing and safe place to live and to travel? I think I would tell you, and I think that's a wonderful question. I think we want to preserve the very positive regard we have for Israel. We don't want there to be those kind of associations with Israel. And again, I think maybe we have to, again, broaden the timeline. We may have to tell them we have very good reason to believe. We're afraid of the cost, but we have very good reason to believe that Israel will emerge victorious and we will rebuild. It has rebuilt so many times. Tell the stories of the Yishuv, of the 48, of 67, of all the other instances and times of Entebbe, where the Israelis displayed their remarkable ingenuity and their strength and their resolve. And so give them that balanced picture and tell them that we are anxiously awaiting the time when Israel will be a meaningful place to revisit. And I think we're not Nevi'im, but I think we can safely hope and presume that will happen. My 7th grade were playing family with their friends and overheard them playing security. I love it. And then I asked my 7-year-old later what they were securing, and he didn't have a response to me. In these situations, you probe more, assuming they are mimicking life, and add, what do you think they were doing, and talk more about the situation. No, if they're playing it, I would tell you don't. Well, the 7-year-old maybe you can talk because they're already processing in language, not the 4-year-old, but you can play it. Like you can, if they're playing security, one of the things you have to be careful about with playing children, if they're replaying the same scenario over and over again, that means they're struggling with it. So if they're playing security, and let's say they're playing security and the security is constantly being challenged or overwhelmed or something, or people are scared, so then maybe you can get on your hands and knees, take it down, say, here's a new security guard, and this security guard knows what he's doing, and this security guard is going to make sure everybody's safe and happy inside, or something like that. Tell it to them using the very same metaphor they use. Again, I would tell you, I know this is maybe a little unfamiliar for you, and it's been a long time since you've played with figures, but I would, if you'd like some more assistance with that, call me and I'll try to help you more specifically. How he starts going about regular activities, such as celebrating an accomplishment in class, a music concert or performance. What do you suggest to the kids is fine, but we feel guilty celebrating for it with our children? Amazing, great questions. It's interesting, Rabbi Yaakov Bender, who is a principal of Darchei Torah, it's a Haredi yeshiva in my neighborhood, a humongous yeshiva. It has like 2,000 kids. And right after this happened, he had a very nice, like 7-minute clip. I'm sure you can get it online or whatever. And what I liked about it was he was an educator. He stayed in his role. And one of the things he said was, we want to teach our children to be nosaba'ol, to feel for others. And we're not going to do this by making them, recreating a hostage situation in home so they can feel the pain, or making them see graphic pictures. But he said to them, and I'm quoting him now, he said, if you usually send 3 snacks to school, start sending 2 snacks. If the ice cream truck comes, say, you know what? When our brethren are in such trouble, we don't have ice cream. You're not going to starve. You'll be very well nourished without it. And there might be a point. I know my wife and I decided, small thing, we're not having meat on Shabbos now. When there are people in hostage situations, chicken's fine. And everybody has their own way, their own little ways. In fact, I'll tell you another thing I do. Rabbi Block can attest to this. When I teach in YU, my pastoral psychology class, I try to pepper the PowerPoints with cartoons or humorisms, because the topics are sometimes kind of sad. I took all the cartoons out of my PowerPoints now, because it's just not a time to laugh. And so a little bit of Avelis, after 1,400 of our fellow Jews have been killed, that the people are in hostage, makes sense. On the other hand, though, life goes on. We have our mitzvahs, we have weddings, we have celebrations, we have accomplishments. And we can, what we recall in psychology, compartmentalize. I've had situations, again, my situation, but I've had 2 situations where people were sitting Shiva for a child, and a sibling of that child was getting married within a week after Shiva. I'm sure Rabbi Block has had situations like that as well. And I remember saying once to one of those parents, and say, when you walk down the aisle, you're going to cry your eyes out. When the band strikes up the loud music and says, welcome for the first time, Mr. and Mrs., you're going to dance your feet off. We can do that. We can compartmentalize. Rabbi, can I continue? I mean, we're past 10 o'clock. Is that, I'm fine if you think it's okay to continue, or should we?
Whoever wants to go is, of course, welcome to do so, and we'll continue until the questions stop.
Okay, no problem.
And until you're ready to leave.
Right, and it's okay for Ari again. Thank you very much, Ari. You're going with Nimish Rasa. You're going beyond the call of duty, and it's much appreciated. Okay, okay. Now, how do we prevent our kids from becoming war obsessed, and even young kids normalizing talk about guns, killing, etc.? Okay, again, it's interesting when schools first started introducing security measures, we as the trauma team were sometimes called in to help this children process it psychologically. In other words, the security firm said what to do in the case of an intruder or something like that. But we had to help the children psychologically. So we were prepared to help kind of the anxious kids, who may be overly scared by what they're hearing about. But one of the kids we hadn't anticipated, but we learned to pay attention to, was the kids who don't like to be made scared. usually the ADHD, more kind of daredevil type of child who would make a joke out of it, and that's dangerous too because it's nefarious stuff. So again, you have to tailor your response to the kid. So the kid who's more worried and scared, we calm them down. The kid who thinks it's a lot of fun and becomes and has exaggerated sense of heroics and his own power, we have to sometimes frighten them. So you may have to inform a child who's overdoing it with the war and the guns that it's not funny. It's not something, it's something we take seriously. A little bit, all kids do this. And we should be proud of the heroism, the courage of our Jewish soldiers. But it's not something to be pleasurable. It's not something to really preoccupy ourselves with. It's the famous, I think it's a Rashi, I don't remember, but when Pinchas got the Brisi Shalom, Moshe Rabbi Block will correct me. Why did he get a covenant of peace? Because you shouldn't internalize. You have to kill someone. It shouldn't become part of you. And we have to do the same. We're shaping our children into the adults we want them to be. And that's part of the work. So again, tailor your responses to your child. What do you say to a 10-year-old child who heard Hamas will come to America next and is scared because he thinks the increase in security is because Hamas will target American Jews next? It's interesting. When we were in Pittsburgh after the shooting, and we were working with the Hillel Academy there, one of the questions we got was, okay, now somebody did it. Now every other anti-Semite might think, wow, well, it's a good idea. We'll do it too. And maybe we're more in danger. And they were right. That was insightful. There is what we call nasa keheter. If somebody does it now, it's not such a taboo anymore for someone else to do the same. But my answer, or the answer we gave them was, that's true, but the FBI knows that too. And law enforcement knows that true. And I think we do need to remind our children that right now, first of all, right now, Hamas, I believe, is on the run. But even if not, that we have a government and we have a police force and we have law enforcement that are invested in our protection as we are. And it's true that we have to be more careful now, but we have the wherewithal. So we don't deny the reality that there are dangers. I wish I could, but we don't deny the reality of that. But we focus more on the availability of protective services. Okay, my 6-year-old wants to know why Hamas is letting this happen. How do I respond? That's a great question. These are amazing questions. Wow. It's a very interesting, this actually came up after, if you recall, the Leiby Kletsky murder and the horrible event with the Hasidic boy who was abducted and killed and dismembered by someone from our community. And one of the questions that came up was, how do we portray this guy, this Levi Aaron, the guy who did it? Do we tell our children he's sick, or do we tell our children that he's evil? And this is an interesting question that we grapple with because, we believe that there are evil people. There is evil in this world. On the other hand, one of the consequences of the emergence of studying human behavior, of our whole field of mental health, is that we can explain anything. So as I say sometimes jokingly, so Osama bin Laden came from a broken home, and Charles Manson was bullied when he was a child. And maybe Haman, was, might have had, his parents might have gotten divorced. And so do we explain away, all bad behavior, or is there such a thing as evil? And I think my inclination would be, with a 6-year-old, is to just, and I think it fits from our hashkafic perspective, from our perspective of what Amalek is, that there are evil people in the world. They're a minority, and most people are good. We have to tell our children that. Even Gentiles are good people and caring people, but there are those people who are evil, and maybe work that into their awareness. And we do everything possible to get rid of them and to protect ourselves. When I was processing this with the YU Smicha students in a class I teach with Rabbi Rothwachs, he said something very compelling. He said, the only part of the Torah that we have to read, according to everybody's opinion, straight from the Torah, is Amalek, is descriptions of attacking weak people, of attacking women and children. And we have to read it from the Torah, and maybe God does that. Maybe it's a message from Hashem. We have to be aware that there is such a thing in the creation of this kind of evil, and this might be a way to approach. If you're not comfortable with that, it doesn't sit well with you, let me know. We can talk about maybe alternatives. Oh, wait a second. You said and I misread it. So why is Hashem letting this happen? I'm sorry. I thought he was asking about Hamas. I didn't see it clearly. Why is Hashem letting this happen? So that's an unusual. Okay, that's an unusual question for a 6-year-old. And I think the way I would approach that with a 6-year-old is to say that we don't understand why Hashem does, but Hashem is in a lot of pain with us, and Hashem is that Hashem is not very unhappy that this had to happen. Try to cast Hashem in a kind way, but just say very cryptically that this is beyond our comprehension. And just how parents can manage when one parent does not want to shield this 9-year-old from any information, and another wants to try to approach the info in an age-appropriate way. So, like anything else, where parents, Hashem Hashem did not create the world that 2 clones raise children. In fact, there's that famous Gemara in Sanhedrin where we talk about the Ben Sora Mora. The parents are like indistinguishable. I guess that's maybe how you raise a Ben Sora Mora. Hashem really wanted to children to be raised by people who are different, and it's through that differences that we grow. Process it with each other. First, try to reach some consensus, and doesn't mean necessarily even compromise. Listen to each other, understand each other's perspective, and by the way, keep in mind that what might be right for your 9-year-old is not right for your 7-year-old, and see if you can come to some kind of consensus. Usually when parents, and I'm assuming it's not reflective of any kind of more broad discord in terms of raising parents, in which case please do get some professional help. But if it's limited to this, which can certainly happen, then usually the more lenient position or the safer position is the one you adopt. But process it, talk it over, and listen to each other, and see if you can reach a consensus. Okay, how to address the tsunami of anti-Semitism of the world. So I think I talked about that. If I didn't address it enough, if you want to discuss it further, please feel free to reach out to me. Are there suggestions of the potential event of Hamas sharing disturbing videos? Yes, okay. Hamas is threatening to show some very disturbing videos. And again, my position with the internet, with the iPhone, all the smartphone and all that is, we rule it. It doesn't rule us. We're not shunning it. We're not putting it away. We're not going back to the rotary phone. But we're going to control it, and we have to know that there will be things there that we should not be seeing. We have to know how to recognize it and know how to shut it down. And we have to very stringently tell our children that. And certainly any kind of videos of the hostages and hostages begging. But I don't think there is a circumstance when any of us, unless we're working for the Israeli Intelligence Corps, that we should be watching that. If grandchildren are asking their grandparents who live in Israel to come to US when their parents know that it's a non-starter, how can we discuss it? We discuss it. And let the grandparents discuss it. Let the grandparents say, we feel like we have to live here. Let the grandparents process it with the children, and again, convey their certainty, convey their security. That we feel very secure. We trust the Israeli army. We have precaution. We have a sealed room. We have bunkers, the miklat, and we're going to take care of ourselves. And we're going to make sure we're okay. And say it with stolz, say it with certainty, and that'll be reassuring to the children. How do you talk to young kids? Oh, I'm almost at the end. Okay. I talk to young kids, preschool and elementary, that Israel and the Jewish people have overcome all sorts of attacks before without instilling fear in young children that Jews have always been hated and killed. Jews have not been always hated and killed, but Jews have been recurrently persecuted. It's the reality of our world. Now, if it's, your child, and everything I say only applies if it fits with how you know your child. I never tell a parent, I never assume I know better than the parent what their child needs or doesn't need. But if your child is mature and capable of understanding that, this is part of the destiny of the Jewish people, that intermittently we are exposed to anti-Semitic excesses, and we do everything possible to protect ourselves, and we do everything possible to withstand it and survive, and we have been successful, and you can name all the people from Pharaoh to Hitler. whom we have survived, but we can't, and this is the reality now. And our children need to know that there's going to be, there may be very well be instances. They may come to a shul one day and there may be a swastika on it. And they may walk down the street and people will shout things at them. And we do everything we can, and we have a government that protects us, and we can report such things, and people who do such terrible things can get arrested. But it is part of our destiny. It's part of our history. And as Rabbi Block mentioned before, our children are living through history. And there's I'm very positive. There's a lot of positive, but there's also that negative. That exists. My mother, when she was a child in Europe before the war, and she was the only Jewish child from a Hasidic home in a Western European school, the children used to chase her home, throw rocks at her, and tell her, "You killed Jesus." And that's her. In fact, she didn't know who Jesus. She thought she killed someone because she couldn't ask her Hasidic parents. And this is our history. And she lived till 91. She was a survivor, and she was a great grandmother. It's part of our history. It's part of our reality. For elementary kids, school kids who want details, how do I answer details without traumatizing them? Very good question. They also know how to protect themselves. Believe me. Give them a piece of the information. Read them. If they have too much, they'll say something like, "Okay, I have to go play with my friend." They'll let you know what they can handle and what they can't handle. Also, you can say, "I don't know." Or you can say, really, if it's a kid who's just almost like obsessively asking and is asking for more information in your sense than they can handle, you can say to them, "You know something? This applies to me and this applies to you. Sometimes we can know too much. Sometimes we have to take a break from this information." Like I said, sometimes I have to put the book away. Sometimes we have to stop and teach them that skill that what's that term, that titrate? That's what the doctors use. We titrate information just like we titrate medication. Okay, then thank you. Let me just post, I'm gonna just, on the chat, I'm gonna post my contact information. Let me just see if I can do this to everyone. Here we go, okay. So I'm gonna give you my OHEL email address because it's just simpler. And if it's urgent, you can text me or call me at this cell phone number. Let me see if I put it down right. 572-7657. They are in blumenthal@gmail.com. Yeah. So this is okay. Let me see. Okay. This is a way, and if you don't have a chance to take it down or whatever, right? Block has full permission to share my contact information. Again, I thank you, and I think that your questions were amazing, and I join you in hoping and praying for all the very good deeds that we're doing and everything that's happening in our community, that everybody should be returned home unharmed and further protected from all that evil that had caused us such harm.
Thank you so much, Dr. Blumenthal, for your wisdom and guidance. And again, I do have Dr. Blumenthal's contact information. So if you didn't copy it down here, please do reach out to me. I'm happy to provide it for you. He is very gracious with his time and with his wisdom. And continue asking. If you have any further questions, you can reach out to me,
please,
or Dr. Blumenthal. And we're looking forward to speaking again soon under better circumstances. Everyone have a wonderful night.
Thank you. Okay. Good night, everyone.